So thanks for joining today. Obviously the topic is managing flexible working requests, because obviously with everything that's happened with the pandemic, the lockdown, a lot of people's circumstances have probably changed, or maybe they've decided that, you know, actually they enjoy the flexibility of being able to work from home or spend more time with the children, or whatever reason. So we anticipate that you may get some flexible working requests coming through, and it's important that you deal with these on a formal basis if you can't resolve them informally in the first place. So we'll just go through today's talking points. So we'll start with talking about the right to request flexible working, then the types of flexible working arrangements, the process, a lawful basis to decline, a trial period, and fairness and consistency. So we start with the right to request flexible working. All employees have the right to request flexible working, and this right was extended beyond parents and carers to employees in April 2003. So prior to that, it was only parents or people who have dependents that they care for who could actually request flexible working. But as it states here, in April 2003, that was extended to include every employee in the workplace. It does only apply, however, to employees with more than 26 weeks service. So they've got to be with you for around 6 months before they can actually submit a flexible working request. The employee must not have made a previous flexible working request within the last 12 months. So this is quite helpful really as a business for you to be able to manage. So once somebody has put in a request, you've considered it, you've implemented it, they can't then put in another request to change that again or to revert back within those 12 months. So you're quite fine to decline that. The employer must formally consider the request. So this is really important, because you will get some employees who will probably put in, you know, working requests that straight away you know is not something that you are going to be able to accommodate. But it's really important that you consider the request, so you don't just sort of respond to their email or the suggestion with a straightforward no. You let them know that you will obviously formally consider the request and what they're asking for in line with the needs of the business. And a decision must be reached by the employer and the employee formally notified within a maximum of 3 months. So for argument's sake, if someone submits their flexible working request on the 1st of January, by the end of March, there needs to be either a process followed, or if you're informally agreeing it, just agree it, but it's got to be by that 3 month period. It can't go beyond that. So if you look at the type of flexible working arrangements, because obviously this varies for every employee who will submit them and the business as well. So that could look like potentially reduced hours, moving to part-time work, a change to the start and finish time. So, oh, sorry, 1 second. A change to the start and finish time. So if somebody perhaps works 9 till 5, you could maybe then change that till, they may want to change that till 10 till 6 or 7 till 3 or whatever. So there's some of the considerations also. Flexibility with the start and finish time. So some people might say, you know, am I able to start work between the hours of 8 and 10 and leave between the hours of 4 and 6, for example. Compressed hours. So some people may say, you know, I've got a full-time working week of 40 hours a week, but actually I want to try and do that in 4 days rather than 5. So they may start earlier and leave later, and maybe cut the break time down, so that you're able to accommodate all them hours into one. Or work from home, remote working. So obviously working from home is something that we've all had to adapt to recently, and I think given the circumstances where we were forced into remote working and home working, I think probably prior to this there's been a lot of organisations who may have thought, well, actually that wouldn't work for us, or we wouldn't be able to measure or monitor productivity, whereas now we've been sort of forced into this position. There may be a stronger argument from the employee that actually it does work and that the productivity isn't impacted, so you may get a few more of those requests coming through as well. Job share, so obviously you've got the option of job sharing with somebody. So you could have maybe 2 employees who both have full-time roles, for example, and they say, you know, actually both of us want to go part-time, so would it be possible that we job share, and I'll do the first part of the week and that other employee will do the second part of the week. And then term time. So obviously for people with children or any childcare responsibilities, they may want to move towards term time work, and where they only work obviously during the school term times, and then the other weeks are their non-working days. So the process to follow, the employee would submit the flexible working request, and for those of you with our HPC handbook, you'll see there's an appendix to the bottom of the handbook with a formal flexible working request. So the employee will submit that, and that basically details the change that they're asking for, you know, what their current working hours are, and also it puts the onus on them largely to determine how they think it will affect the business, and also what they will do to counteract that. So for example, if they were to say, I'd like to go down from 5 days to 4 days, they really need to identify themselves how they think it would impact the business. You know, they need to acknowledge that within the flexible working request, and they can also put things in to say how they would help support that. So if it was going from 5 days to 4, they could say, okay, well, I usually have 5 meetings a week with clients. I'll try and put them all into one day, for example. So my need to be in the office is slightly diminished. The employee will then need to acknowledge the flexible working request and invite the employee to a meeting. So that's really important that, like I say, you have that meeting and that transparent conversation. If you were to just consider it and, you know, send them a letter back to say no, you could probably face some challenge. So I think the best scenario would be to just invite them to a meeting, discuss the flexible working request, so you can have a bit more of an understanding of where they're coming from, why they're submitting that request. You can discuss any barriers that you feel are present to that flexible working request, and, you know, maybe come to a compromise. But I think it's great to have that transparent dialogue between both parties, so that you can come to some sort of understanding. Because if you are going to deny the flexible working request, I think it's really important to the employee's engagement that you manage that in a sensitive way, so you make it very clear to them as to, you know, for business reasons, why it would absolutely not be possible. So you'd hold the meeting. Following that initial meeting, you'd confirm the decision and discuss the potential alternatives. So you may go away and say, well, actually, you know, we've took what they've said on board. Actually, we're going to have to go away and have a think about this, and then come back to you. And then you could hold another meeting to either confirm the decision and say, you know, actually, no, we're going to have to reject it after careful consideration, or we accept it and you agree an implementation date. Or you would discuss the potential alternatives. So you could maybe say, all right, well, you know, you've said you can work from, you requested to work from 10 till 6. We can't really accommodate that, but you can do 9:30, 5:30. So those kinds of alternatives could be proposed. And then obviously the outcomes are either you confirm the acceptance or the new alternative that you've reached an agreement on, and you issue a contract addendum, just updating their terms and conditions. If that's not the case, you would confirm the rejection, and you have to offer the right of appeal for this. So if somebody gets their request declined, you'd obviously have to give them a very good reason as to why you've declined it, and give them the right to appeal the decision. There is actually a lawful basis for you to decline this on, so you can't just go back and sort of rely on nothing. There's a number of grounds which would probably be helpful that you can rely on. So the first one is extra costs that will damage the business. So if you can demonstrate that, you know, no, actually by you reducing your hours from 5 days to 3, we'd have to get a part-time person in to cover those extra 2 days. That salary plus the on-costs that come with that salary would be detrimental to the business. So we can't accept that. Or maybe that the work cannot be reorganized among other staff. So you may look around and say, well, you know, typically if you were going to reduce a couple of days, we could shuffle your responsibilities around, or if you're going to come in later, we can ask somebody else to cover the phone or whatever. But in situations where that can't, you know, you may look at your staff and say, actually, they're all at full capacity. We can't rearrange that work, and we can't delegate that to anybody else. That's another reason to rely on. People cannot be recruited to do the work, so you may have a specialist skill that they have, and, you know, you can't recruit somebody else to do that specific work. The flexible working arrangements would affect the quality and performance of the role. If you think, you know, actually, if you're compressing your hours from 5 days to 4, we think it'll affect your performance because we don't think it's achievable. We think you need to do it across 5 days. The business will not be able to meet customer demand. So obviously that's a really critical point. If the flexible working would impact the business's ability to meet that customer demand and to service its customers, then that would be a reasonable ground to rely on. There's a lack of work to do during the proposed working time. So this is probably most prevalent in organisations where they maybe service clients. So if you service clients, for example, between the hours of 9 till 5 and somebody's asking to change their hours from 7 till 7 a.m. To 3 p.m, you might say, okay, well, in those 2 hours, we don't, the sole focus of your job is to, or the predominant factor of your job is to service the clients, and during those times, the service wouldn't be accessed, so we wouldn't be able to give you work during that time. Or the business is planning changes to the workforce. So for example, if you're planning on restructuring or changing roles, or you've got anything in the pipeline, to rearrange your staff and structure, for example, you could decline on that basis, because obviously it would probably be remiss of you to accept a flexible working request and then later on make changes to the whole workforce, because it would then be difficult to see how that would fit in. The employer must be able to evidence this in case of the decision being challenged. So if you're going to rely on one of those 7 reasons, which I strongly recommend that you do, you just need to make sure that you can sort of justify that. And I'd always say when you're delivering the outcome to the employee, that you make sure that either the letter and the meeting is very robust. So if you're going to say, it's an extra cost that will damage the business, just put a bit of an explanation behind that, which will make them less likely to challenge. So a trial period, if you are unsure about how this would work, it might be sensible to offer this on a trial basis, because I think, if somebody does request a change to the working pattern, and you think this could be a substantial change, we obviously don't know how that will pan out. So I think I would always recommend, and that if it's something like changing half an hour here and there and you think that's manageable, that's fine. But where somebody's asking, for example, compressed hours or maybe term time, I would always recommend that you do this on a trial basis, because once you've made that confirmation and you've agreed to that change in terms and conditions, that is a permanent change. So doing it on a trial basis gives you an opportunity to assess it and gives you that bit of leeway, really. So it's an opportunity for both the employee and the employer to assess whether the new working arrangement will work for both parties. So if it's a term time, for example, you may do it over 2 terms and arrange a meeting to discuss it at the end to see whether it's worked on that basis. And you should set a reasonable timescale for this, so 3 to 6 months. I think it's really important that you consider things like this, because when it comes to the timescales, because if you were to say, okay, we'll put on a trial period for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, arguably that's not enough time for you to assess whether that would work. So 6 months or 3 months would probably be a better period. However, I wouldn't go beyond the 6 months, because if you put it on a trial period for 9 months and then it doesn't work, I think you wouldn't have as much strong ground to rely on that it isn't working, because arguably they could say, well, we've managed for the past 9 months. So I'd limit it to 6 months for those bigger periods, such as the bigger changes such as term time, but I'd always say from about 3 to 6 months. And ensure that you set a review date and keep to this to avoid the employee deeming this as permanent beyond that date. If you have this trial basis and you agree, okay, it's January now and we'll review this at the end of February, make sure that you set that date, you put it in your calendar and you keep to it, because if you go beyond that review date, if you notify them that you're going to review it to see whether it works, and then a final decision will be reached at that point. If you let that go beyond that, the employee could arguably challenge that and say, well, actually, no, it's deemed acceptance because you put a review date in, you haven't challenged me since, and I've continued to work beyond that trial period. So therefore, it's a permanent change. So fairness and consistency. I think it's really important that you make sure that all requests are meaningfully considered. So don't just follow the process sort of for the sake of following the process, even if you think from the offset, this is definitely not going to work. Make sure that you're demonstrating that you are meaningfully considering all those proposals by doing things like suggesting alternatives, maybe having some more time to think over it, and given obviously a very justifiable reason as to why it won't work if that's your final decision. All requests must be dealt with in the same manner, i.e. for what you permit for one person, if practicable, should be permitted for another. So if somebody comes and says, you know, I've got this job and it's identical to this person next to me and they've just gone down to compressed hours, I'd like to do the same. I think it would be difficult for you to refuse that, based on the fact that obviously it's worked for the identical role with the same person. So that's just something for you to consider. Be mindful of requests related to disability provision. So for example, if somebody was to say, you know, I suffer from mental health, I've got anxiety, for example, and it's considered a disability under the DDI and the Equality Act, they could then say, okay, you know, I'm putting in a flexible working request specifically on these grounds because public transport, for example, makes me anxious. So I don't want to travel between the hours of 8 and 9:30. I would prefer to leave my house at 9:30 a.m. and 10 up at work for 10. If you were then to decline this and you didn't have a strong, reasonable ground to decline it, and you know, something that you could really say, we absolutely can't move on this, that could be potentially discriminatory, because it could be deemed as your duty to make a reasonable adjustment. But as I'm sure some of you know, if you do have any disabled employees and they make requests, you do have to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate them, and arguably not allowing somebody to start an hour later or finish an hour earlier based on the grounds of disability, I think would leave you on very dodgy grounds. And for requests relating to childcare, you make sure all possibilities are explored before declining this, such as the offer of alternatives. I say this because oftentimes you'll get people, maybe predominantly females, requesting to change their hours based on childcare commitments. And if you don't permit this change for a female, for example, on the basis of childcare, or a male, and the comparator to that role, so then either the male or the female comparator has had their flexible working request accepted on the grounds of some other reason, you could potentially be up for a discrimination claim there, because you need to be as accommodating as possible when it comes to childcare and care for dependents. But obviously, if you do have any requests come through that seem like a bit grey, or you're conscious that it could be potentially related to a disability or childcare, or you know, you've had a few requests at the same time and you think that you can accommodate one but you can't accommodate another, obviously just pick up the phone to us straight away before holding any of those flexible working meetings, and we can advise you on the best approach, what we feel is the best way forward, and how to handle that with the employee. And that's it from me for today. So thank you for joining today's webinar. I hope you found it useful.